Today, we're going to build this modern end table completely from scrap wood that I had lying around my workshop. For this project, I'm using some 3/4 inch solid cherry cabinet doors and 3/4 inch white oak planks. I began by ripping down all my stock into 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch strips over on the table saw. This process is honestly a little bit repetitive, so I won't show you all of it, but the basic idea is to rip all my material down into uniform sizes. After I had ripped down all my cherry, I then moved over to my oak, doing the same process, except this time I remembered to use a sawhorse as an outfeed table. Now after all that cutting on the table saw, this is what I ended up with. I still needed to make all these pieces of wood a uniform length, so I just measured out a spot, marked it with my speed square, and transferred all those marks over onto each piece of wood. And with all the wood marked out, I was ready to go over to my miter saw to make cross cuts and finally make all these pieces of wood a uniform length. And cross-cutting all these pieces of wood was sort of a tedious and repetitive process, so I'll spare you from most of it, but just know that I cut down all my pieces of wood into a uniform length. With all the cross-cuts done, I could then do a dry fit and see what the pattern of the table would eventually look like. And I considered a few different designs, but ultimately I landed on this every other oak cherry alternating pattern for the tabletop. And here's the first preview of what the table will look like. Once I was happy with the design, it was time for the glue up. I'm using Titebond 2 wood glue, and I just apply a liberal amount to every single plank, making sure that I don't miss any spots. Then I made sure to spread out all the glue evenly over the surface of each piece of wood. And after all the glue had been applied, I rotated each piece of wood 90 degrees and joined them together in preparation for clamps. Once I was done with the glue up, I used a set of clamps to apply even pressure to all sides of the soon-to-be tabletop. And to make sure that I didn't glue this tabletop to the tabletop of my workbench, I moved it over to some offcuts. And after making sure that I had even pressure throughout all my clamps, I left the piece to dry overnight. And the next day I came back to find that all the glue was dry, so I began taking off the clamps just like that and flipped my tabletop over. Then I took off some of those offcuts that I had used to space the piece overnight while the glue was drying, only to find out that some of them were stuck on pretty good. So I came back with a mallet, and with a little bit of work, I had them off in no time. And in order to make a circular tabletop, I needed to find the center of my material. So to do this, I measured out the center point of each side, and then marked that through with a speed square. And after finding the center, I sunk a nail into that point, which I could then use as a pivot point to trace out a circle onto the base of my tabletop. And using a piece of string, I measured out an appropriate radius for the complete diameter of my tabletop, marked that off, and then using a pencil, I transferred that line onto the bottom of my tabletop. And once I was done, I had a nice circle all the way around my soon-to-be tabletop, and I just popped off the nail with the other side of my hammer. Then I used my jigsaw to cut out the circle that I had just transferred onto the wood. Cutting this out wasn't exactly the easiest process because the jigsaw isn't the most precise tool out there, and if I was going to do this again, I would use a router with a circle cutting jig, but unfortunately I didn't think of that when I was cutting this out. And some of those little imperfections from the jigsaw were transferred over onto the final cuts, but I was able to smooth most of them out by the time that this piece was completed. And after all those cuts, this is what I ended up with. And then it was time to sand. I used 80 grit sandpaper on my random orbital sander to clean up the glue squeeze out, as well as the finish left behind on the Cherry from its previous life as a cabinet door. Once I had taken off most of the glue and finish, I began working my way up from 80 grit sandpaper all the way up to 220. And after sanding, the top of my table felt really smooth, but the edges just didn't really match. So to address this, I used a 1/4 inch roundover bit on my trim router to give the whole tabletop a nice, smooth profile. And after rounding over the entire tabletop, I repeated this same process on the bottom. But after going over the top and bottom with my router, I realized that I still had a little bit of excess wood that I needed to take off. So to do this, I used my random orbital sander to take down most of that excess. And after taking away most of the excess from the sides of my tabletop, I still had just a little bit of material to remove. So to address that, I went over all the edges once again by hand with a spare sanding disc. And after smoothing out the edges, I went over the tabletop once again with my orbital sander using 220 grit to address any of the marks that I might have made during the hand sanding process. This is what I ended up with. And before applying finish, I removed all the excess dust left over from the sanding process with a rag. Then, using a different rag this time, I applied a coat of Watco Danish Oil in the shade Natural to the top and sides of my tabletop. In the end, I applied 3 coats of oil to the tabletop and waited 30 minutes in between each application. And once the finish had fully dried, I was ready to turn this wooden disc into an end table. To fasten the legs, I used 1/2 inch pan head screws, and initially I was a little bit concerned that these wouldn't be strong enough, but in the end, they worked perfectly. And this is what I ended up with. Not too bad in my opinion for a table made completely out of scrap wood. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for plenty more videos to come.